Samuel Carter had spent most of his life in solitude, tending to his ranch on the outskirts of Wyoming. His land stretched for miles, bordered by dense forests and snow-capped hills, passed down through generations of his family. Winters here were always brutal, but nothing could have prepared him for the blizzard that would alter his life forever. Sam wasn't one to dwell on hardship. He found solace in the quiet routine of ranch life, the crisp sound of snow crunching under his boots, the warmth of a fire crackling in his stone hearth. But lately, loneliness had crept in more than usual. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 6 years ago, and their only daughter, Emily, had moved to Denver, leaving Sam with little more than his cattle and his aging Australian shepherd, Buck, for company. That evening, the wind howled against the cabin walls, shaking the shutters and rattling the window panes. Buck, usually calm, let out a sharp bark, his ears standing alert. Sam glanced at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "What is it, boy?" he asked. The dog barked again, more insistent this time. Sam listened, his brow furrowing as a faint, desperate cry cut through the roar of the storm. Setting his cup down, he pulled on his heavy coat, boots, and gloves before grabbing a flashlight. The moment he stepped outside, the wind lashed against him like a whip, stinging his face and cutting through his layers. He pushed forward, each step sinking into the knee-deep snow, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. He followed the cries, trudging toward the tree line at the edge of his property. As he reached a cluster of pines, his flashlight caught movement, a small, huddled mass, half buried in the snow. Sam's breath hitched. 8 tiny bear cubs lay curled together in a trembling heap, their fur soaked and matted with frost. Their mother was nowhere in sight. His heart pounded. He had seen lone cubs before, usually orphaned due to a mother's injury or death, but never this many. The odds of survival for a single cub in a storm like this were slim, let alone 8. Leaving them was out of the question. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around as many as he could carry, cradling their small, frozen bodies against his chest. Buck ran ahead, his barking urging Sam forward as he fought against the wind, stumbling back toward the cabin. Once inside, Sam shut the door against the storm and rushed to the fireplace. He piled on wood until the flames roared, filling the cabin with much-needed heat. Carefully, he laid the cubs near the fire, rubbing their tiny bodies to restore warmth. Their whimpers tore at him, fragile and desperate. Buck sniffed them, then settled down beside them as if to stand guard. "Where's your mama, little ones?" Sam murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He knew bears didn't abandon their young unless something had gone terribly wrong. A deep sadness settled over him as he wondered what had happened to their mother. As the hours passed, the cubs stirred, one by one, their dark eyes flickering open with fear and confusion. Sam felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose. The next morning, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. Sam woke to the soft sounds of the cubs moving near the fire. Their tiny eyes followed him as he brewed his coffee, their curiosity evident. Buck wagged his tail, keeping a watchful eye on the newcomers. Sam sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. His first thought was practical: these cubs couldn't stay here. He wasn't equipped to raise wild animals, let alone 8 bear cubs. He would have to call wildlife services. Yet, as he watched the smallest one struggle to stand, only to tumble into its siblings, his resolve wavered. They had barely survived the night. What if no one could come for them in time? What if they didn't make it? Sam exhaled heavily and reached for a can of condensed milk. Pouring it into a shallow dish, he set it down in front of the cubs. Their noses twitched as they caught the scent, and soon, they were eagerly lapping it up. A small chuckle escaped him. "Well, you sure are a hungry bunch," he muttered. The reality of their situation loomed over him, but for now, they were safe. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. As Sam watched the smallest cub struggle to its feet, only to tumble into the others, his resolve wavered. They had barely survived the night. What if no one came for them? What if the nearest wildlife officials couldn't reach them in time? With a sigh, he grabbed a can of condensed milk from his pantry, pouring it into a shallow dish. The cubs hesitated at first, their tiny noses twitching as they sniffed the air, but hunger soon won out. One by one, they lapped at the milk eagerly, their small tongues flicking against the surface. Sam couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, you sure are a hungry bunch," he muttered. The rest of the day was spent improvising. He scoured his barn for supplies, gathering old wooden crates and hay to fashion a makeshift pen in the corner of the cabin. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. The cubs huddled together inside, a tangled mass of fur and tiny paws, their exhausted bodies finally able to rest in the warmth. Despite the overwhelming situation, Sam felt something stir deep within him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Yet, as night fell, doubt crept in. He was no expert in wildlife care. Raising a handful of orphaned bear cubs was no small task, let alone 8. How long could he manage before the authorities arrived? He sat in his armchair by the fire, watching the cubs sleep, their small chests rising and falling with soft breaths. "Maybe I need you as much as you need me," he whispered. The following days settled into a new, chaotic rhythm. Mornings began with feeding the cubs, a process that quickly became a test of patience as they scrambled over each other in excitement. Keeping their pen clean proved equally demanding, as they grew bolder and more curious, tumbling out of their designated space and wandering the cabin on unsteady legs. Buck, ever patient, took on the role of an unlikely babysitter. He nudged them back into the pen when they wandered too far, his watchful eyes always keeping track of them. Sam found himself observing their personalities. The largest cub, whom he named Boone, was the leader of the group, always the first to investigate new things. The smallest, a runt he called Rosie, was timid, often clinging to her siblings for comfort. Then there was Finn, mischievous and fearless, always getting into places he shouldn't. And Bella, who seemed happiest curling up in Sam's lap whenever she had the chance. One evening, as the cubs played near the fire, tumbling over each other in a clumsy wrestle, Sam realized he was smiling more than he had in years. The cabin, once quiet and lonely, now overflowed with life. But reality loomed over him: these cubs were wild animals. Eventually, they would have to return to the wilderness where they belonged. That realization hit harder than he expected when the first real challenge arrived. It was a crisp, clear morning, and Sam was checking on his cattle when Buck's frantic barking shattered the silence. His stomach clenched as he sprinted back toward the cabin, fear gripping him. He threw open the door and froze. Chaos reigned inside. The cubs were agitated, huddled around something on the floor. Rosie, the smallest, lay motionless on her side, her tiny breaths coming in shallow, labored gasps. Sam's hands shook as he scooped her up, her body limp in his arms. "Hang on, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice cracking. With quick, practiced movements, he grabbed an old veterinary kit, one that had belonged to his late wife, Margaret, back when she had cared for the ranch animals. He examined Rosie with growing concern. She had a fever, likely an infection. Time was critical. For 2 days, Sam barely slept, tending to Rosie with everything he had. He kept her warm, administered antibiotics, and monitored her every breath. The other cubs stayed close, as if they understood the gravity of the moment. Buck rarely left her side, resting his head against her tiny body. Then, at last, Rosie opened her eyes. She let out a weak but determined squeak, and Sam exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he whispered, wiping at his damp eyes. That moment changed everything. The cubs weren't just a responsibility anymore, they were family. As the days turned to weeks, the cubs grew stronger. Their fur became glossier, their movements more confident. The once silent cabin was now filled with their playful chattering, their tiny paws padding across the wooden floor. Word of Sam's unusual house guests eventually spread through the small town. Neighbors stopped by, some bringing food and supplies, others just curious to see the cubs for themselves. Some offered help, but Sam was wary. He didn't want them to become a spectacle. They were still wild creatures, and deep down, he knew the day would come when he would have to let them go. But for now, he would give them a fighting chance. Sam had no intention of turning the cubs into a spectacle. He kept visitors to a minimum, only allowing those who truly wanted to help. The last thing he wanted was for the cubs to become too accustomed to human presence, knowing their best chance of survival depended on their ability to return to the wild. Still, the solitude that had once been his way of life was no longer the same. One evening, as Sam sat by the fire with Buck curled at his feet, the cubs tumbled around the cabin, playing and exploring. The loneliness that had weighed on him for years had started to lift. In its place was a renewed sense of purpose, something he hadn't felt since Margaret passed. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The cubs' futures remained uncertain, and the road ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Yet, as he watched them wrestle and chase each other, he felt something stir in his chest: hope. Word of Sam's unusual house guest spread through the small town, eventually catching the attention of a wildlife biologist named Dr. Emily Carter. She had spent years working with bear rehabilitation programs and heard about Sam's predicament through the town's grapevine. On a brisk January morning, her truck rumbled down Sam's snow-covered driveway. The sound of crunching ice under her tires echoed through the quiet valley as she pulled up near the barn. Sam met her at the front porch, his posture wary but hopeful. "You must be Dr. Carter," he said, shaking her gloved hand. "Call me Emily," she replied with a warm smile. "I hear you've got a handful inside." Sam led her into the cabin, where the cubs were scattered near the fireplace, some playing while others curled up drowsily. Emily's eyes lit up as she observed them. "They look healthy," she said, crouching down to get a better look. "You've done a remarkable job, Mr. Bennett." "Just Sam," he corrected. "I've just been doing what I can. They're the real fighters." Emily spent the day examining each cub, checking for signs of malnutrition or health issues. She explained the long process of rehabilitation and what it would take to prepare them for release. She stressed the importance of minimizing human interaction to ensure they could survive in the wild. "It's going to be tough," she admitted, "but it's not impossible. They have a chance." For the first time since the blizzard, Sam felt a glimmer of relief. He wasn't alone in this. Emily promised to return with supplies and resources to help make the transition easier. With her guidance, Sam made significant changes to the cubs' care. He built an outdoor enclosure behind the barn, adding climbing logs and hiding spots to encourage their natural behaviors. At first, the cubs were hesitant, but soon they were exploring their new environment with enthusiasm. Reducing his interaction with them proved to be the hardest adjustment. He missed the way Bella would curl up in his lap or how Boone would nuzzle against his hand. But he knew it was necessary. Buck, however, remained a steady presence, bridging the gap between human and animal. One afternoon, as Sam observed from a distance, he noticed Rosie attempting to climb a tree inside the enclosure. She struggled at first, her tiny paws slipping against the bark, but she refused to give up. When she finally reached a low branch, she let out a triumphant squeak. Sam chuckled, pride swelling in his chest. Emily's visits became more frequent, and over time, a bond began to form between them. They shared stories over coffee, finding common ground in their love for animals and the wilderness. For the first time in years, Sam felt a connection to someone beyond his ranch. As winter gave way to early spring, the cubs became more adventurous. Their playful antics brought joy to Sam, but also new challenges. One morning, he discovered that Finn had managed to slip out of the enclosure. Panic shot through him as he searched the ranch, calling out for the mischievous cub. Buck's frantic barking led Sam to the creek, where Finn was stuck in the freezing water, shivering and frightened. Without hesitation, Sam waded into the icy stream, the cold burning against his legs as he reached for the cub. Finn whimpered as Sam pulled him to safety, his small body trembling violently. Back at the cabin, Sam dried him off and held him close, heart pounding. "You've got to be more careful, little guy," he murmured, his voice thick with worry. Emily arrived later that day and, upon hearing what had happened, scolded Sam gently. "You're doing an incredible job, Sam, but you can't let your guard down. These cubs rely on you." Her words stung, but Sam knew she was right. He vowed to be more vigilant. Then, one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, Buck's low growl broke the silence. Sam grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the chilly air. His eyes scanned the tree line, and then he saw her, a large female bear standing at the edge of the property, her eyes fixed on the cabin. His pulse quickened. Could this be the cub's mother? She made no move to approach, but her presence was unmistakable. The next morning, Emily confirmed his suspicions. "It's possible she's been searching for them," Emily said, watching the large female bear from a distance. "But after all this time, she might not recognize them as her own." Sam stood beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The sight of the mother bear, whom he had begun calling Matilda, filled him with conflicting emotions. He wanted the cubs to return to the wild, to live as they were meant to, but the thought of them venturing into the unknown filled him with unease. What if she rejected them? What if they weren't ready? Emily suggested a slow, carefully planned reintroduction. It wouldn't be as simple as opening the gate and hoping for the best. Matilda had to show willingness to accept them, and the cubs needed to develop the instincts necessary to survive on their own. As spring arrived, the cubs grew stronger and more independent. Their once clumsy steps became more confident, their playful wrestling turned into sharpened skills of defense and hunting. Sam and Emily worked tirelessly to prepare them, introducing new challenges, encouraging natural behaviors, and limiting human contact. Meanwhile, Matilda's visits became more frequent. At first, she lingered in the tree line, barely visible through the thick brush. But as the days passed, she began edging closer to the enclosure, watching with quiet intensity. Then, one afternoon, she finally approached the fence. Sam and Emily stood still as Matilda sniffed the air, her massive frame looming over the cubs. The young bears responded with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Boone was the first to step forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air between them. Rosie followed cautiously, her small frame trembling with uncertainty. One by one, the cubs inched closer. Emily exhaled slowly, a hopeful smile playing on her lips. "This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for," she murmured. Sam's heart swelled with a bittersweet mix of pride and sadness. Seeing the cubs interact with Matilda was proof that they were still wild at heart, that they had never truly belonged to him. He had done his part, and now, he had to let them go. As the days grew warmer and the last patches of snow melted from the hills, the time for release drew nearer. Sam found himself cherishing every moment with the cubs, watching them wrestle, climb, and nap beside the fire. He knew he had to say goodbye, but the idea of parting with them weighed on him. Matilda continued to watch them daily, her dark eyes filled with a longing Sam couldn't quite put into words. Boone was the first to press against the fence, sniffing tentatively at Matilda. Slowly, the others followed suit. Emily placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. "She's showing maternal instincts, and the cubs are responding," she said gently. "But we have to be patient. If we rush this, it could end badly." To make the transition easier, Sam and Emily expanded the enclosure, installing a gate that could be opened when the time was right. It would allow Matilda to enter at her own pace, giving the cubs the choice to follow. The process required trust, both in Matilda and in nature's course. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, Sam sat on the porch with Emily. "You think they'll be okay out there?" he asked, his voice tinged with worry. Emily smiled. "I do," she said softly. "They've grown so much, Sam. You've given them the best possible start. Now, it's time to trust nature." That night, Sam barely slept, sitting by the fire and watching the cubs one last time. He knew the day was coming faster than he was ready for. And then, it arrived. Matilda lingered near the gate, her presence commanding. The cubs paced nervously, sensing the change in the air. Sam and Emily stood silently, watching as the gate swung open for the first time. Matilda hesitated, sniffing the air cautiously. Then, with a deep, rumbling grunt, she stepped inside. The cubs froze, their tiny bodies quivering with a mix of fear and excitement. Boone was the first to step forward, his small frame trembling slightly as he inched closer to Matilda. The massive bear lowered her head, sniffing at him curiously before gently nudging him forward. Rosie followed next, hesitating for only a moment before pressing against Matilda's side. One by one, the others joined, their initial fear giving way to a hesitant curiosity. Emily sucked in a quiet breath, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "She's accepting them," she whispered. Sam watched, his chest tightening with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had spent months caring for these cubs, watching them grow from fragile, helpless creatures into strong, thriving bears. They had become his family, but now, they were finding their way back to where they truly belonged. Over the next several days, Matilda guided the cubs around the enclosure, teaching them as only a mother could. She led them to the small trees at the edge of the space, showing them how to climb, how to use their claws for balance. She dug into the earth, unearthing grubs and roots, and the cubs followed suit, mimicking her actions with playful enthusiasm. Sam and Emily remained at a distance, careful not to interfere. The sight was both heartwarming and painful. Sam had known this day would come, but now that it was here, letting go was proving to be far more difficult than he had imagined. The time had come to return Matilda and the cubs to the wild. Emily had arranged for their transport to a wildlife reserve, a protected area where they could live without the dangers of hunters or human encroachment. It was a safe haven, the best possible place for them to grow and thrive. But getting them into the transport trailer was another challenge entirely. Matilda, wary of the enclosed space, hesitated at the entrance, her protective instincts flaring. The cubs, sensing her unease, stayed close to her side, reluctant to enter. Sam took a slow breath, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We have to be patient," he said, his voice calm. "She needs to know it's safe." With gentle coaxing and plenty of time, Matilda finally stepped into the trailer, her cubs following suit. Sam stood by the open door, his hand resting on the latch. His throat tightened as he looked at them one last time. "You'll take care of them, won't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I promise." The trailer door closed with a final, echoing thud. Rusty let out a soft whine at Sam's feet, sensing his sorrow. Sam stood there, unmoving, watching as the vehicle disappeared down the long, winding road. That night, the cabin felt emptier than it had in months. But as Sam sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, he found solace in knowing he had done the right thing. The cubs were where they belonged. Weeks passed, winter slowly fading into spring. The ranch was quiet again, but Sam found ways to fill his time. He rebuilt the barn, planted a vegetable garden, and even took in a stray cat that had wandered onto the property. Rusty seemed to enjoy the company, and Sam found unexpected comfort in the small, simple joys of daily life. Emily visited often, bringing updates on the cubs. "They're doing great," she told him one afternoon, showing him photos of them climbing trees and exploring their new home. "Matilda's teaching them well." Sam smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "They're tougher than I gave them credit for," he said. "I guess they had to be." Over time, what had started as a professional collaboration between Sam and Emily grew into something more. Their shared love for wildlife and the land deepened their bond, turning friendship into something warmer, something unspoken but understood. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Sam received an unexpected phone call. A local news station had heard about his story and wanted to feature it. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't the type to seek attention. But as he thought about it, he realized that sharing his experience might inspire others to care for the natural world. The segment aired a week later, showcasing the incredible journey of Matilda and the cubs. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the country, people praising Sam for his kindness and courage. Encouraged by the reaction, Sam decided to share his own story. He set up a camera on his porch, Rusty sitting faithfully at his side, and began to record. "Hey everyone," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I'm Sam Callahan, and I want to share a story that changed my life. It's about 8 bear cubs, a blizzard, and how a little kindness can go a long way." As the video concluded, Sam looked directly into the camera. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're all connected, humans, animals, the land. We have a responsibility to care for each other. So I'll leave you with this question: what's one small thing you can do today to make the world a better place?" The video went viral, touching the hearts of millions. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of kindness and connection, creating a ripple effect of positivity. And as the first snow of the season began to fall, Sam stood on his porch, watching the world turn white once again. This time, he didn't feel alone. This time, he felt hopeful, knowing that the story of the cubs had left a lasting impact, not just on him, but on the world. The story of Sam and the bear cubs teaches us profound lessons about compassion, resilience, and the interconnectedness of all living beings. In a world often driven by self-interest, Sam's journey reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples far beyond what we imagine. His decision to help the cubs, despite uncertainty, reflects the courage it takes to step outside our comfort zones and make a difference. Just like Sam, we all face moments where we must choose between convenience and doing what is right. His story also highlights the power of patience and trust in nature's process, whether in nurturing relationships, facing challenges, or embracing change. Most importantly, it reminds us that no one is ever truly alone. When we extend kindness, whether to people or animals, we build connections that sustain us. In the end, compassion has the power to heal both the giver and the receiver.